I'm Jane McLenachan, and I live in Glasgow in Scotland. I'm in the fortunate very happy position of being retired, but I've got a background as a child protection social worker, and then, so the first half of my career was in child protection social work, and then the second half was in social work education, working in universities in England and then latterly back in Scotland. Came back to Scotland in 2014, coincidentally the year of the independence referendum, back very enthusiastic about returning to what was going to be a progressive country, a country that was committed to social justice and fairness. And oh, what a disappointment that has been. I think if you think about, well, it's quite interesting actually, if you just think about Nicola Sturgeon. I remember I'm not sure when it would have been, probably round about 2019, 2020, there was a big WASPI demonstration for the WASPI women in Glasgow that ended up at Govan, and Nicola Sturgeon was at that and was speaking, and quite a few of us who I would then subsequently find out were part of the women's rights movement. I didn't know them, and I didn't know them at the time, were there and cheering on Nicola Sturgeon, speaking very eloquently in defence of women's rights to fair pensions. And then in a matter of probably months, or certainly less than a year, I was finding myself saying, what on earth is she saying? What is she talking about? I think it would have been maybe around about 2019. I can't remember exactly when it would be. But then I remember the Holyrood debate about the Forensic Medical Services Bill, and I think that was that 2019 or 2020. So the bill that was going through Holyrood, dealing with the forensic medical examinations of women and girls who'd been subject, or people who had been subjected to rapes or sexual assaults. And it was the time where Joanne Lamont, who at that point was still a Labour MSP in Holyrood, had her amendment, what became known as a 6-word amendment, where she proposed an amendment to the bill that was saying for gender replace sex. So where the bill used the word gender, she was arguing that the word gender should be replaced with sex. In other words, clarifying categorically that any girl or young woman who was being medically examined following a sexual assault would absolutely be medically examined by a female. And I remember just being totally shocked, really, that was even having to be mentioned, because with my background of working in child protection social work, I had worked with many girls, young women, adult women who were going through those forensic medical examinations after allegations of rape or sexual assault, and that those examinations would provide evidence that would then be used in court cases against their abusers. And the idea that those women and girls would not have been examined by a female medical examiner, it was just inconceivable. So the fact that we were even having a debate about the possibility that they might be medically examined by somebody who wasn't female was just incredible, that we were actually having to say that. So I remember being just kind of dumbstruck at that and thinking about the implications for some of those women and girls that I had worked with. Somebody could present themselves as it could be in that medical examiner role, and be saying, I'm a woman, when in fact they were a man identifying as a woman, and that the original principles of that bill were to allow that to continue, so that a girl, coming forward to be examined following a rape or sexual assault, walking into an examination room at an extremely traumatised and stressful time of her life, to be told that, it's okay, you're going to be examined, it's only going to be women that are going to be with you doing the examination, and going into a room and finding somebody who might be wearing a skirt, but she can tell categorically is a male. So that was just shocking that was even being contemplated. So the importance, I think, of Joanne Lamont's amendment cannot be overestimated for girls and women who had experienced and who will continue to experience rape and sexual assault, that amendment guaranteed them the right to be examined by a female, and a recognition that how somebody chose to identify was utterly irrelevant, and that the most important thing in that situation is the needs, the protection, the dignity, the safety of women and girls who are, by virtue of the fact that they have been sexually assaulted or raped, are extremely traumatised and vulnerable, and that their needs absolutely had to be the top priority. It's funny, I've heard a lot of people talking about a particular event piquing them. And I think, I don't actually think I've got a specific piquing incident, if you like. I think I had been, I have a good friend who had been talking about the gender ideology stuff over a number of years. And I think, if I'm honest, I probably didn't, it's not that I didn't take it seriously or that I dismissed it, but it wasn't having an impact on my own life, which seems strange given that actually at the time I was working in a university. But strangely enough, back prior to 2020 when I retired, it wasn't there. It wasn't it wasn't evident, certainly in the context of the university that I was working in, or the wider context that I was working in. So it wasn't hitting me in terms of my own employment experiences. It wasn't hitting me in my own personal life experiences. So I think it was more of a gradual process of becoming more aware. I think probably Twitter helped that, because I joined Twitter in 2018, and at that time initially probably I haven't looked back, but probably if I did look back, practically all of my tweets at that point in time would have been related to social work or social work education or the UCU, the University and College Union dispute, pay dispute and conditions dispute, because we were involved over those couple of years in several strikes and industrial action that I was absolutely part and parcel of. I was out on picket lines, and that was the time that I kind of got involved in Twitter. So my Twitter feed, as it developed, would have been entirely around supporting the UCU dispute and related things to that. But I suppose one of the things that happened, that by being part of that Twitter community, if you like, is that you start seeing other things. So you're seeing posts about other things and more posting about women's rights and gender ideology and what was happening in Scotland, and then maybe things around the women's representation on public boards. And I think gradually those various strands coming together, along with, as I said, the medical forensics bill, and then I think the nail in the coffin, I think, for me was the Nicola Sturgeon broom cupboard speech. And I think that was probably late 2021. And I could barely believe what I was seeing and hearing, that there was this woman who'd, proclaimed herself to be a feminist, championing women's rights, who'd, spoken, as I said, in defence of women's rights to fair pensions, etc., etc. There she was in some makeshift cupboard, is what it looked like, which was totally bizarre, because she always presented very professionally, and there she was sitting in this space doing this wee heartfelt piece to camera that was expressing her grave concerns about all these people threatening to leave or having left the SNP over the gender ideology stuff, and her pleading with, as my husband describes them, the pink-haired people, to not leave, that she was absolutely for them and on their side, and her biggest concern seemed to be that all these blokes who were pretending to be women didn't rush off and leave the SNP, and that's who she was pleading to remain in the party, when what she was supporting and arguing for was fundamentally opposed to the rights, the protections, the safety, the dignity of the women and girls of Scotland. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing and hearing. In fact, I remember watching it. My husband and I both watched this broadcast and were just dumbstruck. And in fact, I think it might have been the catalyst that led him, because he was actually a member of the SNP, and he wrote and cancelled his membership. And he said in his resignation letter that he wasn't having, his wife and the women that were in his life being accused of being bigots and Nazis and whatever else we were being accused of. And if that was the stance that the SNP was taking, then he wasn't going to remain part of it. And needless to say, he never got a response to that letter, but he certainly wasn't alone, I don't think, at that time. And the mass resignations from the from the SNP. I wasn't involved in any particular women's groups at that time. I was more, I think I was more aware of concerns and issues about affecting women's rights from my background in being involved in women's rights, which is one of the things that makes me particularly angry, I have to say, about the accusations of that those of us who are speaking out about women's rights and safeguarding of children are being accused of being right-wing, fascist, Nazi bigots, because the reality is so far from that as to make it's such a ludicrous accusation. And I think I'm certainly at the stage now where it's water off a duck's back. You can say what you like. I don't care. I really, really don't care. And because I know what my history is, and my history is actually left-wing and trade union campaigning. And campaigning, funnily enough, and being a shop steward in trade unions that are now some of the worst attackers of women's rights. So, I would include the UCU and Unison in that. I was active member of, in both of those unions. I was a trade union member throughout my entire working life. I supported and organised activities, disputes, picket lines. I've been there on all of that, spoken at trade union conferences, and to think that a union like Unison, for example, with a vast majority of female members working in services like social work, working with some of the most vulnerable and traumatised women and girls in our society, and that union is now prioritising the demands of men. It makes me absolutely furious. And to think as well around UCU, you know, Jo Grady, the UCU, who was the UCU General Secretary, I supported her campaign to become the General Secretary because I was actually really impressed with her during the, you know, previous disputes before she ran for office. And I thought, there's somebody coming from a working class, rank and file background, committed to defending and supporting the pay conditions of ordinary trade union members across the university sector. And then, as the years went on, and some of her statements around all the gender ideology stuff and her defence of this vulnerable, most oppressed sector of society, men, has just been absolutely bizarre. And I'm ashamed of the fact that I've supported people like that. And, you know, I think if I was still working, I actually don't think I could still be a trade union member, and I find that shocking, an absolutely shocking position to be in, that because of speaking out in defence of women's rights and child safeguarding makes that stance becomes incompatible with being a trade union member. How have we reached that position? It's absolutely bizarre. And I spent, from the 1970s, been involved in national abortion campaigns. I seemed to spend half my life in the late 70s trundling up and down in buses from Glasgow down to London on some abortion demonstration through London or another. Been involved in Reclaim the Night, rape crisis supports. I was actively campaigning against Section 28. I was working as a social worker when Section 28 came in. I was working with young women who were experiencing the fear of what was going to happen to them in school if anybody found out that they were a lesbian, and with teachers who were fearful of what was happening. So when they talk now about what's happening to these poor, marginalised, oppressed men who think they're women and equating it to Section 28, it's absolutely ludicrous. It's, and I'm sure most of the people talking about it have absolutely no idea what Section 28 was all about, and certainly weren't involved in campaigning against it. So they have no basis. We didn't, even with all the horrors that were Section 28, it wasn't requiring young people to be drugged or to have their body parts removed. So the comparison is absolutely ridiculous between Section 28 and opposing gender ideology. I've been on the streets in Scotland and in England, marching against the National Front and the English Defence League, been involved in do you remember the days of Rock Against Racism? Yeah. Rock Against Racism activities. So this whole notion that my views now on defending women's rights have turned me into a right-wing fascist bigot. It's so ludicrous that really we shouldn't do anything other than just laugh at them. It is so pathetic. And the interesting thing is that actually I would say the vast majority of women that I've met in the last 5 or 6 years being involved in the campaigning against gender ideology are similarly women coming from left-wing and trade union backgrounds. That, I would say, that's the majority. And it's not, it's not a right-wing cause. There might be people with right-wing beliefs who are involved and maybe involved for all sorts of different reasons, but that's not the body of the women who are involved in this fight. And in the constitutional context in Scotland, it's also interesting that I think a significant amount of the women that I've come across in the campaign are actually women who were actively involved in supporting the campaign for Scottish independence, and includes lots of women who were active and at senior levels, some of them very active in the SNP. And the SNP has lost all that. They've lost that support, they've lost those members, they've lost elections, they've lost MPs and MSPs on the basis of this. They've lost a huge amount of funding because of the MPs they've lost. And still John Swinney is sticking his heels in and not being prepared to budge on this, carrying through the ludicrous policies of Sturgeon. It's a disaster, an absolute disaster for the women of Scotland, and he'll mend them at the election. I don't think my position politically has fundamentally changed. I think that what's changed is how others are describing those political positions. So when people that describe themselves as left-wing or socialist are supporting demands for men to be in women's sports, rapists to be in women's prisons, boys to be in girls' changing rooms, these to me are not left-wing and socialist objectives. So it's not me that's changed in my political outlook. It's those who describe themselves as promoting left-wing and socialist objectives. They are so far removed from any principles that would constitute, left-wing or socialist objectives. So it's not me that's changed. And if being socialist now requires you to defend the right of men to be in women's spaces, to defend the right of people like Upton and Rose, whatever his name is, in Darlington, to be in the changing rooms of those nurses, then okay, I'm not socialist. Because I can't accept that, and I also don't accept that there's anything left-wing or progressive about that. It's absolutely nonsensical and I challenge any of those people to seriously argue a rationale for why those proposals are founded on left-wing principles. So when we think about the protest outside the FiLiA conference in Glasgow in 2023, where we had Hateful Tom and his cabaret leading the abuse and the shouting abusive comments at women from the other side of the road, joined by Glasgow City councillors, including the Elaine Gallagher that I know that Jean was talking about in her interview. And that's all they can do. They just shout abuse because they have nothing left. They have nothing to say, nothing concrete to say. And every time there's a women's event, whether it's down in England or whether it's here, whether it's outside Holyrood, whether it's been any of the Let Women Speak events or any of the Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht events across Scotland, if any any media person, any reporter goes and tries to talk genuinely and quite respectfully to the protesters, they get banners shoved in front of the camera, they get just told to F off, they're not talking to Nazis, and asking sensible, serious questions. And we saw that recently again in London with the protest at Elephant and Castle at Southwark about the leisure centres. They don't talk. And trade unions there with their banners proudly proclaiming their support for men being in the women's changing rooms. Ask them why they support that. Why is that a fundamental principle of trade unionism? They can't answer. All they've got is abuse and intimidation and threatening. And I think one of the real positives now is, I think, the number of women who have said, enough is enough. I am not being silenced. You can threaten, you can intimidate as much as you like. I will not shut up. And the examples of, some of the women in the Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht book, interviews with people like Jenny Lindsay and Maggie Gibson who've had horrendous implications for their personal and professional life and are saying, no, you won't stop me. You won't stop me speaking. I will continue to do so. And I think it's incredibly powerful, those messages from women who really have sacrificed an immense amount. And I feel incredibly lucky, really, that I don't have to weigh any of those things in the balance because of my position, because I'm not employed, so I've got no employer or no regulatory body to threaten me. I've got a family that's completely on side with my views around this, which I know is not the case for a lot of women. There have been huge numbers of women who've experienced major fractions in their families because of gender ideology, which is absolutely horrendous personal experiences for them. So I do regard myself as very, very fortunate to not have had to, not face any of those sacrifices. I think probably the main thing that has been significant in terms of me being able to link in with other women was getting involved with the Women's Rights Network in Scotland and meeting face to face, but also kind of more online conversations with other women and realising that there are women from the borders right up to the Highlands and Islands are in this campaign, and just that sense of solidarity that you're not speaking to nobody. There are other women there. I think also realising that women are active in a whole myriad of different ways, and for somebody like me who can speak out, I can speak at a public event and not worry about my face being seen or somebody doing something. I go on the radio phone-ins and have nice little chats with John Swinney about how it's just not good enough that he's not implementing the law. And I can do that, and I recognise that for a lot of other women in the certainly in the Women's Rights Network and in other networks, are incredibly busy behind the scenes. You know, women who are making things that are being used publicly, whether it's posters or, you know, template letters to send out. Women who are writing constantly to their MPs and MSPs and doing all sorts of things, sometimes on a one-to-one individual basis. You know, the women that are having the conversations with their delivery driver, with their hairdresser, with their next door neighbour, down the shops. These are all just as important as the actions of those that are able to speak publicly. Those, just building those connections are really important. And I think that network of women supporting each other has been really vital for some of the women that are more isolated. There's women who are geographically very, very isolated and have nobody around them that they can see on a face-to-face basis and talk about all this. So the ability to link in with a wider network is really, it's important to help them keep going, really. And I think that is really important. I've had a number of kind of interesting wee experiences, just, for example, on the basis of wearing my green, white and purple scarf. And I remember once I was in Glasgow and I'd been in with my mum and I was putting her on the bus to go home, and a woman came down and was getting on the same bus, and she just looked at my scarf, and she just, as she's getting on the bus, she's giving me a thumbs up and she's saying, "Nice scarf." And I think it was just before something in Glasgow. It might have been the Let Women Speak in Glasgow. I can't remember exactly, but she said to me, "And are you going to be there tomorrow?" And I'm giving her a thumbs up and saying, yes, we're there. And I met somebody I was at an event, I think it was a St. Paddy's Day event in the Merchant Square in Glasgow, that covered up bit. And I was standing listening to a band, and again I had my scarf on, and this woman was beside me, and she was just kind of looking at me for quite a few minutes, and then eventually she came over and she said, "I like your scarf." So we just started chatting, and honestly it was just, we were there for ages, and she just offloaded about how difficult it was. She had children at school and she was trying to deal with what was happening with the LGBTQIA blah 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 club at school and the implications for her children and tackling things in the school. And there she was just doing all this on her own, and family and friends had fallen out with her, and just the cathartic benefits of a conversation on the basis of a scarf. And I think those little things are really important when, you know, you're walking past people and you just give them a nod and a smile because, you know, and point at the scarf or whatever it is. And it just, I think it lets people know that actually there's more of us. It's not just me. And even internationally, after the FiLiA debacle in Glasgow, where we were shouted at from across the road by the councillors and their hangers on. And I wrote a letter to the Herald that got published in the Herald about that. And I think a day or so later, I was at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery, funnily enough, with a friend who isn't on side on all of this. And we're waiting in the queue outside the women's toilets. And this woman in the queue, who turned out to be from Canada, said something, I can't remember exactly how it got started, but said something about the women and men in toilets or something. And we exchanged a couple of words about that. And then she just said, and what's all this about what's been going on in Glasgow? I read a letter and I'm saying to her, that was me. And so we were having this conversation about what had gone on at FiLiA. She'd seen this and was saying what on earth was happening. Why were women attending a feminist conference being attacked by counsellors? That is absolutely outrageous. So we're there having this conversation, and my my not on-side friend was just shrinking into the background, not wanting to take part in it at all. But that was absolutely brilliant. And she's saying, oh, we'll have a photograph, we have to have a selfie. I'm going to take this back to my friends in Canada. We've got this as well in Canada. We're on this fight back in Canada. So, and just things like that. It just reminds you that, yeah, we are on the right side. We are absolutely on the right side. I think one of the things that I have found really shocking is the professional bodies. So in settings, for example, and I'll talk about social work because obviously that's my professional background, but I was absolutely shocked and disgusted and extremely angry at, I'll use the example of Rachel Meade, the social worker down in England who was disciplined by her local authority and investigated by Social Work England, the regulatory body for social workers in England, was subjected to a horrendous process there, took it to an employment tribunal, and actually that was a really, really important, profound win for her in that employment tribunal. Her employer and Social Work England were roundly condemned by the employment tribunal for their handling of this situation, because the reality had been that the regulator had investigated an experienced social worker, so similarly to Sandy Peggy, an experienced professional with no record of any concerns, any disciplinary concerns, any practice professional concerns. But what they did was that they acted on the complaint of one individual, an activist, and any interrogation of his circumstances and background would have revealed in an instant that he was a trans activist. So they acted on that, and she was reported for having liked, or maybe even, heaven forbid, reposted things on a private Facebook page that were about related to child safeguarding or sports, males and female sports. And she was reported to the regulator. She was suspended from her employment and subjected to the traumas, as we all know, and people are still going through them, the traumas of the employment tribunal. And the actions of the regulator, just astonishing that they can behave in that way. And then we've seen it recently with Anne Woodhouse and that, again, successful employment tribunal against the Health and Care Professions Council, who again defended I would say, an abusive, intimidatory man against a professional with years of practice experience without any professional conduct concerns at all. And the actions of these professional and regulatory bodies, it's inexcusable. And particularly now, when they keep doing this, they keep taking these actions against workers for, not even speaking out, but just maybe privately liking something that somebody else has said, when there is no excuse now for not knowing what they're doing. These bodies know what they're doing, so they are deliberately victimising women and continually victimising women. And it's still happening. I'm also involved with the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance, and we know through that of social workers in practice and social work lecturers who remain too frightened to speak out. Now, after everything that's happened, after all the successful employment tribunals, still being scared into silence. I was involved in in FiLiA in 2025 there, involved with a couple of other women. We organised a social work workshop at FiLiA around, looking at issues around implications for feminism, feminist perspectives in social work practice. And needless to say, quite a lot of the discussion in the workshop ended up being centred around the implications of gender ideology. And what was really, it was a fantastic discussion, really, really excellent discussion. But what was in a way quite depressing about it was the number of women, student social workers, practising social workers, and social work academics, who all were represented at the workshop, who were talking about their own experiences of being investigated on their courses or in their employment role, and that currently, we're not talking about, back in 2021 I was investigated. It's now. And again, we've talked about the trade unions, but the trade union bodies and in social work, things like the British Association of Social Workers, they're not supporting those workers. The trade union is not supporting those workers. And they shouldn't be in that position in the first place, particularly in a profession like social work, where the capacity for adopting an evidence and informed and research-based approach to your practice, and for having an ability to think critically, analyse information and evidence that comes to you, and come to informed conclusions based on that analysis. These are fundamental requirements of social work practice. And yet, we've got students in universities on social work courses being actively discouraged from adopting critical thinking around issues to do with gender ideology. So what does it say about the future of the profession? It's terrifying, really. And I think I really do hold the professional bodies absolutely culpable in perpetuating a dangerous situation. And I do say dangerous because I think if we're not enabling and encouraging student social workers to have a critical approach to their practice, then, and to have the ability to have challenging and difficult conversations, then if you can't have a difficult, challenging conversation with your colleagues, how on earth are you going to have a difficult conversation with a parent whose child you're there to potentially remove because of child safeguarding concerns, or someone whose mental health is a risk to themselves or other people? That's some challenging conversations you need to have. And if you haven't developed the ability to have a challenging conversation about whether men can be women, then you're not set up to be a safe and competent and professional practitioner. So I do, although I'm obviously not in practice and not in education, I feel really, really strongly about the disregard for child safeguarding that this ideology represents, when we're encouraging children and young people to genuinely believe that they can become a different sex, when that is patently, obviously, an utter lie. What else are we telling those children to believe that is not true, when we're telling them that the traumas associated with their mental health or their previous experiences of abuse, or the stresses associated with living in a family with domestic abuse or drugs or alcohol or mental health problems, that those stresses and pressures will all go away with drugs that will make them infertile, will give them sexual problems in the future, or will affect their growth, will give them osteoporosis, or surgery that will remove bits of their body that can never be put back on. That is child abuse. And I feel really angry at the professionals who are enabling and encouraging and facilitating this. And I include social workers in that. I include, they're not the ones clearly that are dishing out the prescriptions for, puberty blocking drugs, and they're not the ones cutting off young girls' breasts. But if they are going along with an ideology that is allowing young girls to think that that's what they need to do, then yes, they're culpable. I remember speaking I went in, I think it was 2023, I went to the Kelly J. Keane Hyde Park picnic, and I spoke at that, and for once I didn't just rant all my own stuff. I'd actually been sent something which, it relates to what I was saying earlier about the privileged position of being able to be open and not be fearful about speaking out, because what that's also meant is that I've been contacted privately by a number of people saying thank you for speaking out, and feeling bad that they're not. So, and I think it's really important to be saying, no, you don't need to be feeling guilty about that. You're doing what you can do. And somebody contacted me who I did know from a previous employment context, and who sent me basically a story about her own childhood experiences, and was saying things like, I was a tomboy, I loved doing all the things that the boys did, I wanted to wear what the boys did. I wanted my hair like the boys. I didn't want to be a girl. And it was the things that she associated with being a girl. And she said, you know, fortunately for her, her mum just kind of went, yeah, that's fine. You go and climb trees. You wear your trousers, get your hair cut short. Absolutely fine. Not an issue. And then as a teenager, she describes kind of just developing a better sense of her own femininity and realising that what she'd been rejecting in her earlier childhood was, although she wouldn't have at that stage been able to articulate it in that way, but what she recognised subsequently is that she was rejecting the gendered stereotypes associated with being a boy and being a girl, and that she saw herself much more akin to what you were allowed to do as a boy and rejecting what you were kind of encouraged to be as a girl. And as a teenager, she just became more aware of that and became more kind of accepting and in tune with her own femininity and developed through, and that was all absolutely fine. But what she said was that a reason for kind of contacting me with this story was about saying, I dread to think what would have happened to me if that had been now, or if my mum hadn't adopted that attitude, you know. So if you're a wee girl like that and you've got a parent, and that's what we're seeing with some of these children, very young children being trans now, it's parents doing it. So that wee girl's wanting to be out climbing trees with the boys and playing rough and tumble and having her hair cut short and all the rest of it, and you know, parents are saying, oh gosh, that's not really what girls do, so really you must be a boy. Think really you're obviously born in the wrong body, so we must do something about that. And it was that kind of angle that she was wanting to highlight. You know, this is an adult, mature woman, but she was wanting to say. I think about it now, and I think, gosh, if you know what's happening now to the girls who were like me all those years ago. And I've spoken as well to adult gay men who've said that as well, that you know were quite kind of feminine in their approach and the things that they wanted to do. And I had a conversation with one a while ago who was saying, I really do. I shudder to think what would have happened to me if I was a wee boy now. I wouldn't have been allowed to just grow up and develop my sexuality and develop my feminine and masculine sides to my personality and my persona. And I think that is abuse. I can't describe that in any other way. I think any parent, any professional, any teacher who are encouraging or allowing children to believe something that is fundamentally untrue is not only culpable in a child in an abusive situation for that child, they're also culpable in an abusive situation for all the other children round about them, because they're demanding that those other children conform to a set of beliefs that are untrue and could be damaging for them as well. I think I probably in kind of equal measure have my commitments around continuing this fight, if you like, are around ensuring that we actually get back to some sense of a recognition of safeguarding women's rights. And I can't believe how far back we've gone. You know, we were maybe too complacent back and, you know, years ago that, oh, we've got the, when we got the Sex Discrimination Act, etc., that, oh, you know, we're on the right lines as far as women's rights are concerned, and we've just gone so massively backwards that it's, you know, it's just shocking. So I'm absolutely committed to keeping going with that fight in whatever way, and I'll continue telling John Swinney it's just not good enough for as long as he carries on being as stupid as he currently is. But at the other side, I am also, I think, equally committed to the protection of children. So the safeguarding, the child safeguarding concerns about this ideology and its implications for children and young people they're just horrendous. And I think I can't leave that. I can't let that go unchallenged. So all the kind of stuff just now around the puberty blocker trial, you know, West Streeton says he's concerned about it. Well, stop it. It's quite simple. Don't let it happen. So we can't give up. So many children have already been damaged by this. I mean, all these girls that have had their breast chopped off, all the wee boys that have had their penis chopped off, all the children that have been put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones that have caused irreversible damage to their physical and their emotional well-being. That can't be undone. But what we can do is stop doing it to the next generation. And absolutely that's what we must do. So I think I'm two-pronged on this campaign. And I totally understand why some people are entirely, it's the women's rights side, but I see them as integrally connected. And I think when you attack and undermine women's rights, you're getting into that key, you're undermining the key safeguarder for children. So when you tell women that it's okay that, you know, men, that bloke isn't really a bloke because he's wearing a frock, then it's okay for him. And I mean, if we think about the wee girl in the Borders, went into that horrible abuser's car because she had been told to believe that he was a woman and she, you know, this wasn't going to be concerning. So everybody that's enabled and allowed that for that wee girl is culpable in the abuse that wee girl suffered. And that's, no, we have to stop that. And I don't care what insults and abuse the proponents of this chuck at me. I genuinely don't care. I think maybe the times that I'll come back to the speaking at that, the Kelly J. Keane picnic a couple of years ago. So after I'd spoken, because I read out that woman's story to me, and after that, and I also had said something about at the beginning, because that was at the time where the Rachel Meade Employment Tribunal was, I think she was probably still crowdfunding for an employment tribunal. So I said something about social work and, you know, supporting Rachel's crowdfunder. And after I'd spoken, I had several people came up to me in the, just where we were all sitting, to talk about their own experiences. And one of them was a woman who actually got really quite distressed, and she was talking about her work experience with a young girl who was saying that she was a boy, and the organisations, are vulnerable, traumatised, with mental health problems, young women, and she'd run away, and she'd been found, picked up by the police, and the police treated her as a boy, and various things that had happened. And this woman was really distressed about what had happened, and was really distressed that her attempts to talk to the relevant people, to the police, to the psychiatrist that was working with this girl, that they were all denying the implications of her being placed in a setting, a psychiatric setting, that was a male setting, and this was a vulnerable teenage girl. And she felt really responsible for what might be happening to that girl, and she had nobody to talk to, because her employer was supporting this action. So I think it's things like that when you provide I think even just being a sounding board for people, and or giving people a voice when they're too frightened to use their own voice. And it is related to the bit about I don't care, nothing can happen to me kind of thing. So I can say those things, speaking at something about and speaking at an event and speaking out the words of a parent whose child had been transitioned at school behind their back, and that parent couldn't, was obviously trying to deal with things within the school, but couldn't speak out publicly. So I think maybe things like that, and just that I will go on the radio, and I don't care. It's Jane from Glasgow, and you think, everybody would think. But the number of people who've said, I'm going right. It's Jane from Glasgow again. I'm going to hear, right? Going to listen to all this, and I think there's so many women can't do that. They can't do that because of the personal or employment position that they're in, or because they just don't have the confidence or what have you. And I think maybe it's, I don't really care what people think about me, particularly. The people that, yes, the people that matter to me, I care what they think. But all the others out there, if somebody's thinking, oh God, there's that transphobe on again, I don't care. I really don't care. It doesn't bother me. So even if there were, things being posted afterwards that were being negative or derogatory, I really don't care. I really don't care. That's what I mean in a way about my frustration with the people who I believe should know better about all this, is just closing their minds to these experiences. And And people who have knowledge of these things because of their own professional backgrounds. I just think there's no excuse for that. There might be an excuse for, Joe Bloggs down the road who's never given any of this any thought, and when somebody says, well, what's the harm? Well, if he says he's a woman, what's the problem with sort of going along with that? There's maybe a tiny wee excuse for somebody just at, face value kind of saying, I don't know what's the issue, because they haven't thought about it, they've not had any experience or what have you. You'd like to think they'd then go away and think, well, maybe I better find out about this. But for those with professional knowledge of the areas that this affects, there is no excuse. There really is no excuse. It highlights the thinking behind Morton and his cronies, who thought that we'll get men into women's prisons and then the rest is a dawdle. And that's true. You can understand that rationale from their perspective, because women in prison, who cares about them? They don't matter. So who's going to worry about anything that's happening to them? It's absolutely evil, and they were evil, but the politicians and the public bodies who continue to go along with it, they might deny that they think that those women don't matter, but their actions say that. John Swinney's words in Holyrood the other day, they're saying exactly that. I don't care about those women. Because if he did care, he would have done something about it long ago. And it's not that they don't know what the consequences are. And it highlights the importance of really, really publicising who the Scottish Government speaks to and listens to and who they don't speak to and listen to. They're an echo chamber. And all the stuff about the conversion practices ban, that report was an utter nonsense, that advisory report. They only talked to the only people involved in that advisory group were the people who were going to tell the Scottish Government what they wanted to hear. I think one of the things that's been great is I've gone along to things, and I've maybe gone with somebody that I already knew and then met other people, and you kind of think, you feel as if you've known them for years. And yet you've not hardly known them for any length of time at all. Somebody you might have met 3 times and you see them again and it's just like your long lost buddies, because you're just on the same wavelength. And I think you're on the same wavelength on this. You might have completely different political views on other things, and that's been a really interesting experience for me, because I suppose I've not, in my background, politically, I've not really engaged very much with people who might have entirely different political opinions on other issues like, I don't know, the economy or immigration or, whatever it might be. But in this, I have done. and that's been a kind of learning experience as well. Do you think, well, yeah, they're actually just ordinary people, and I can talk about, you can have a discussion and you can disagree about things, and that's okay. You see somebody walking down the street wearing a scarf, go and talk to her. Just say, oh, hello, I like your scarf. If somebody says that, I'll stand and talk to them. So just those kind of, so I think the visual displays that highlight who we are always very good. I wore my scarf. I've got pictures of me with my scarf on the Great Wall of China. And I had a woman came up to me from, I think she was from Colombia or somewhere, and had to get a picture with me and her with the scarf. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it? You've just got these you're given a visual message, and so I would say if you see somebody, then just sidle up and say, I like your scarf, or whatever it is, and come along to events and come and just talk to people that are there, because I think we'll always embrace new people, if somebody's on their own. I know certainly and I know other groups will do that as well, but certainly in the Women's Rights Network, if there's something happening, an event like Let Women Speak in Glasgow or Edinburgh or something like that, we'll always say, we'll have a wee group for women that are going to that, and here's, if we're going to meet, or I'll be wearing this, or that's something about what you'll look like, or what you'll be wearing, or something like that, or a wee place to meet, so that women coming on their own can come and meet somebody somewhere else away from the actual event and walk together to the event. I think we've definitely moved forward in the right direction. Do I think it's nearing being over? Sadly, no. I think the whole ideology is so entrenched across all our bodies, all our public bodies, all our institutions, at government level. It's what it's going to take to shift it. I don't know. I really don't know, because each time we get a win, and you think, wow, that'll be it. So if you take the Supreme Court ruling, for example, almost a year ago, and I think we all thought at the time, well, that's got to be one of the final nails in the coffin. They can't be, continuing after that. And here we are. And the government hasn't budged one iota, and they're still pushing out funding to the organisations that support all this. And that thing I saw recently, what is it, £200,000 contract for some bid around supposedly gender equality. And you just look at who that's aimed at, who's able to respond to that. It's money to the same activist organisations So I think, I don't know, I get to the point at times where I think, right, we need to take to the streets. That's it. We need to stop being nice. We need to be doing whatever, we're at the man in the barricades times, possibly, I don't know. I sometimes I despair when I think, how can we still be where we are after everything that's happened and all the wins, all the progress, all the steps forward, and still they're still there. These activists are still in key central positions across, or they've got the key people in the organisations are running scared of them for whatever reasons. And that's a whole other issue. But then on the other hand, I think, well, no, if you think about where we are now compared to where we were 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, or even less, in terms of the public's, public knowledge about what's going on and the implications. It's certainly not universal, but there's a lot more awareness now than there was before. The amount and range of people who are willing and able to speak out has much improved. And I get a bit frustrated, I have to admit, with some of particularly the politicians who are now being a bit more pro the defending women's rights side of things, and all, and like, Anas Sarwar and Jackie Bailey doing their stuff about, oh, well, if we knew then what we know now. And you just think, you what? What exactly is it you know now that men can't become women that you didn't know then? And I get quite frustrated and I get quite angry at people like that now kind of trying to present themselves as being on the right side. But then I do try to tell myself that that is all positive, and we should allow them. We need to allow people to recognise that they were wrong. The frustration, I think, is that they don't admit they were wrong. They try and cover it up and obfuscate, and I think, oh, just be honest. We made a real balls up of that.
You've been listening to Unsilenced Project.